The Oslofjord is not a natural harbour. It is a corridor. It runs south to north for approximately 100 kilometers, narrow enough in places that a man on the western shore can read the name painted on the hull of a ship passing to the east, and deep enough along its center line that the largest warships afloat at the time of the Second World War can navigate it without difficulty. The mountains that press in on either side are not the dramatic vertical walls of the western fjords. They are lower, rounder, forested with spruce and birch that in April are just beginning to show the first grey-green of new growth on their upper branches. The water is dark, iron-stained from the rivers that feed it, carrying the cold of snowmelt down from the hills in a slow, steady, invisible current. In the pre-dawn hours of an April morning in 1940, before the light has fully separated the surface from the sky above it, the Oslofjord is a place of almost perfect stillness. The sound of a ship's engines carries across the water for distances that crews accustomed to the open sea find surprising. The echo off the rock faces returns that sound twice, sometimes 3 times, in overlapping frequencies that make it difficult to judge distance or direction. Sound in a Norwegian fjord does not travel in straight lines. It wraps around headlands, bounces off cliff faces, arrives from directions that have nothing to do with the direction of the source. And at the narrowest point of the fjord, at a place called Drøbaksundet, where the channel contracts to fewer than 500 meters between the island of Høyre to the east and the town of Drøbak on the western shore, there is a fortress. It has been there in some form since the 17th century. Its guns have been improved periodically as technology changed and the calibers required to stop the ships of each era grew larger. By April 1940, the fortress on Oscarsborg Island mounts 3 28-centimeter Krupp guns, designated Aaron, Moses and Joshua, installed in 1893 and never fired in anger at a living target. It also mounts a battery of torpedo tubes pointing into the narrowing channel, connected to a fire control system operated by a crew that has practiced the sequence but has never released a live torpedo against a moving hull. The corridors of the fortress smell of salt and damp stone and the particular cold that seeps through masonry walls in buildings that have stood through 2 centuries of Norwegian winters. The fortress commander is a 65-year-old colonel named Birger Eriksen. He has been in the Norwegian army for decades. He commands a garrison of approximately 450 men, many of them reservists who have been at their posts for less than 48 hours when the sound begins to come up the corridor from the south. It is April 9th, 1940. The time is approximately 04 Zunga. And what is coming up the Oslofjord in the darkness, without lights, without advance warning to the Norwegian authorities, without any of the diplomatic formalities that the laws of nations require before a fleet enters the territorial waters of a neutral country, is Group 5 of the German invasion fleet, the heavy cruiser Blücher leading, followed by the heavy cruiser Lützow, the light cruiser Emden and several smaller vessels carrying troops of the 163rd Infantry Division, designated to capture the Norwegian capital and the king and government within it before dawn. The Blücher is the newest heavy cruiser in the Kriegsmarine. She has been commissioned for less than 6 months. She displaces over 14,000 tons, mounts 8 20-centimeter guns in 4 turrets, and carries on this morning approximately 800 soldiers above her normal complement of nearly 1,000 crew, men of the 163rd crammed into the ship's lower spaces and passageways, equipment stacked in corridors, the whole vessel riding lower in the water than her design intends. Her captain, Kapitän zur See Heinrich Voldag, knows he is entering a confined waterway. He has been briefed that Norwegian resistance is expected to be minimal and brief, that the Norwegian government, confronted simultaneously with landings at 6 points along its coastline and with the fait accompli of German military presence, will negotiate rather than fight. He proceeds at reduced speed. He does not man battle stations. He passes through the outer reaches of the Oslofjord in the darkness without incident, and at approximately 0421, he enters the narrowing of Drøbaksundet. Colonel Eriksson on Oscarsborg Island has been awake for hours. His telephone lines to Oslo have been severed. His communications with the naval command at Horten are intermittent and unreliable. He knows that something is happening. The coastal watch posts to the south have reported unidentified ships moving north in the darkness without navigation lights, but he has no authorization to fire and no instructions from higher command. He looks at the silhouette of the large warship emerging from the darkness of the channel, bearing no recognition lights, giving no signals, ignoring the standard identification challenges his signal station is transmitting. He makes a calculation. Under Norwegian law, opening fire on a foreign warship without explicit authorization from higher command constitutes a court-martial offense. He is 65 years old. He has spent his career in peacetime service. He has never fired the fortress guns at anything except timed exercises on empty water. He looks at the silhouette. He looks at the darkness behind it, where more ships are following. He makes a decision that he will later describe as the most solitary of his life and gives the order to fire. The first salvo from Aaron and Moses strikes the Blücher amidships at a range of approximately 1,800 meters. At that range, in those conditions, 28-centimeter shells from 1893 guns penetrate the side armor of a modern heavy cruiser whose crew has not closed down its watertight compartments, has not activated its damage control systems, and is not braced for impact. The shells ignite stores of aviation fuel carried aboard for the ship's Arado floatplanes. The fire spreads rapidly through the interior in the way fire spreads through a ship that is not at battle stations, faster than anyone in the crew is prepared for, through compartments that should be sealed and are not, consuming stores and equipment and men in the spaces below deck before the damage control parties can reach the source. As the crippled cruiser drifts past the torpedo battery, the Oscarsborg crew fires 2 torpedoes into her hull. The Blücher lists to starboard, rights herself partially, and continues drifting northward up the fjord, still burning, for approximately 20 minutes. The light from the burning ship illuminates the channel in a flickering orange that the garrison on Oscarsborg watches in silence. Then she rolls to port and sinks in 35 meters of water. Approximately 830 of her crew and embarked soldiers go into the fjord with her. The water temperature in the Oslofjord in April is close to 0 degrees Celsius. Several hundred men do not survive the combination of the sinking and the cold. The Norwegian government, the king, the cabinet, and the national gold reserves escape Oslo by train to the north in the hours that Eriksson's guns have brought them. They are not captured. They establish a government in exile in London that will operate continuously for 5 years, providing the legal and political continuity that makes Norway's post-war restoration something other than a reconstruction from nothing. And the Blücher, the newest heavy cruiser of the Kriegsmarine, remains on the bottom of the Oslofjord, a monument, though no one names it as such in April 1940, to the first foundational reality of the Norwegian campaign that German naval planning has underestimated. The fjords are not highways, they are traps. The Kriegsmarine has just sailed its most capable cruiser directly into one, and the campaign is not yet 6 hours old. To understand how Germany arrived at this moment, how an operation conceived in strategic logic ended in a fjord with its newest warship on the bottom, it is necessary to go back further than April 1940. It is necessary to understand what Admiral Raeder had been thinking since the autumn of 1939. And why his arguments made sense in a conference room in Berlin in ways they did not make sense in the confined waters of Drøbaksundet. Raeder is, by 1939, one of the most professionally accomplished naval officers in the world. He has commanded the German Navy since 1928, has overseen its reconstruction from the wreckage the Versailles Treaty left behind, and has built it into something that, if not the equal of the Royal Navy in tonnage or history, is at least a serious fleet capable of threatening British maritime trade. The problem Raeder faces in September 1939 is not a problem of professional competence, It is a problem of geography. Germany's coastline is a naval prison. The North Sea exits, the English Channel to the south, the passage between Scotland and Norway to the north, are both monitored and controllable by Royal Navy forces. Any German surface ship that attempts to break out into the Atlantic must pass through one of these two choke points, and passing through a choke point destroys surprise, which is the one asymmetric advantage that a weaker fleet can sometimes deploy against a stronger one. The Z-Plan, Raeder's ambitious construction program intended to give Germany a balanced ocean-going fleet by 1944, has been made irrelevant by the premature outbreak of war. What the Kriegsmarine actually has in September 1939 is built around two battleships, the Bismarck, still under construction, and the Tirpitz, also incomplete. Two battlecruisers, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, 3 pocket battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 6 light cruisers, and approximately 22 destroyers. It is not a fleet that can defeat the Royal Navy in a fleet action, but it is a fleet that can, if properly deployed from the right bases, make the North Atlantic convoy routes dangerous and expensive for Britain to maintain. Norway is the solution to Raeder's geographic problem. A German-controlled Norway gives the Kriegsmarine ports on the Atlantic coast of Scandinavia, Narvik, Trondheim, Bergen, from which submarines and surface raiders can access the deep waters of the Norwegian Sea, and thence the North Atlantic without transiting either British-monitored choke point. The leads, the sheltered inner passage between the Norwegian islands and the mainland, carry Swedish iron ore from Narvik south through protected waters for most of the year, providing Germany with the raw material its steel industry requires in quantities that no other source can match. Swedish ore moving through Norwegian territorial waters is protected by Norwegian neutrality, and Norway's neutrality is, in late 1939, the foundation of Germany's iron ore supply. If Britain violates that neutrality, if the Royal Navy begins laying mines in the leads or conducts naval operations in Norwegian coastal waters, Germany's ore supply is compromised and its naval strategic options contract further. Raeder has been arguing since October 1939 that Germany must act before Britain does. The argument is military, strategic, and coherent. Hitler, who understands land warfare at an operational level and naval warfare hardly at all, listens to Raeder's brief and authorizes planning for what will become Operation Weserübung. There is a specific incident that accelerates Hitler's decision and transforms Raeder's strategic argument from a proposal into an order. On February 16, 1940, the British destroyer HMS Cossack enters Norwegian territorial waters in the Weserübung and boards the German supply ship Altmark, which is carrying approximately 300 British prisoners taken from merchant vessels sunk by the pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee. The Altmark has been sheltering in the leads, those same protected inner waters that carry the Swedish ore south, and the Norwegian naval vessels escorting her through territorial waters have declined to inspect her, accepting German assurances that she carries no prisoners. The British do not accept those assurances. HMS Cossack enters the fjord, ignores the Norwegian protest, boards the Altmark, releases the prisoners, and departs. The Norwegian government protests the violation of its territorial waters. The British government expresses formal regret while making clear that recovering prisoners from a vessel illegally using neutral waters justified the action. Hitler reads the reports of the Altmark incident and draws from them the conclusion he has been resisting for months. Norwegian neutrality is a fiction that both belligerents are treating as provisional, and if Britain is willing to violate it to rescue prisoners, it will certainly violate it more comprehensively when a larger strategic opportunity presents itself. He authorizes the planning for Operation Weserübung to accelerate. The date he sets for execution is April 9, 1940. The plan that emerges from the combined staffs of the Wehrmacht, Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe through the winter of 1939 and early 1940 is operationally audacious in a way that causes professional military planners both admiration and unease. It calls for simultaneous amphibious landings at 6 Norwegian cities: Oslo, Kristiansand, Stavanger, Bergen, Trondheim and Narvik, spanning nearly 2,000 kilometers of coastline, all launched before dawn on April 9, 1940. The same morning, German forces are to occupy Denmark. The whole of Scandinavia is to be absorbed in a single operational day. The concept depends entirely on surprise. If Norwegian coastal defences engage the landing forces before they reach their objectives. If the Royal Navy concentrates against any one of the landing groups before the others have consolidated. If the Luftwaffe cannot provide the air cover it has promised over the landing zones, the plan collapses not in one place, but in 6 simultaneously. The German planners know this. They assess the risk as acceptable. Norway, they believe, will not fight seriously. The Royal Navy, they believe, will be too surprised to react in time. The Luftwaffe will neutralize British air power before it can interdict the landings. Every element of the plan depends on the preceding element working correctly. It is the operational equivalent of a watch, intricate, precise, and catastrophically vulnerable to a single grain of sand in the mechanism. The grain of sand has a name. It is named Birger Eriksen. When the Blücher goes down in the Oslofjord at approximately 06:30 on the morning of April the 9th, the effect on Group 5's mission is immediate and decisive. The Lützow and the remaining vessels, shaken by the loss of the fleet flagship and uncertain of the full extent of Oscarsborg's defences, pull back down the fjord. The troops destined for Oslo do not arrive by sea. They arrive hours later, overland, after the capital's defences have been reorganised and after the government has already gone. The political objective of the Oslo landing, the capture of the king and cabinet in the first hours before a government in exile can be established, is not achieved. It is the single most consequential failure of the campaign's first day, and it stems entirely from a 65-year-old colonel who looked at an approaching warship and made a decision his own government had not authorized him to make. The rest of the campaign's first day unfolds with varying degrees of success and failure across its 5 remaining axes. At Kristiansand, the cruiser Karlsruhe and her escorts encounter resistance from the Odderøya fortress. The initial approach is repulsed. The landing force circles and attempts again under cover of a false identification signal, German ships broadcasting the recognition code for British vessels. And the second approach succeeds when the Norwegian commander, uncertain whether he is firing on Germans or British, hesitates long enough for the landing force to close the range. The city falls, the troops land, and the Karlsruhe turns south to begin the withdrawal to Germany. She does not get far. The British submarine HMS Truant is waiting in the Skagerrak. A spread of torpedoes finds the Karlsruhe in open water south of the Norwegian coast. The damage is catastrophic enough that her crew scuttles her rather than attempt to reach port. The newest light cruiser of the Kriegsmarine joins the Blücher on the bottom on the campaign's first day. At Bergen, the assault group encounters the Kvarven fortress on the approach to the harbour. The light cruiser Königsberg takes multiple hits from shore batteries, hits that damage her severely enough that she cannot immediately continue the mission and must anchor in Bergen harbour for emergency repairs. Her crew gets the engines running adequately. The troops are landed. Bergen falls. The Königsberg anchors, taking on water, her damage control parties working through the night of April 9th. On the morning of April 10th, 16 British Skua dive bombers flying from the Orkneys find her at anchor. At that range, the Skuas are operating at the outer limit of their fuel capacity, with nothing in reserve for a second attack. They get one pass. It is enough. The Königsberg, stationary, damaged, unable to maneuver, is struck by multiple bombs and capsizes in Bergen harbour. She is the first major warship in the history of naval warfare to be sunk by air attack. The distinction will not remain unique for long. Within 2 years, air-launched attacks will transform naval warfare entirely. But in April 1940, it is a new kind of lesson, and the Kriegsmarine has just paid for it with a cruiser. At Trondheim, the operation succeeds most completely of any of the 6 landings. The heavy cruiser Hipper leads the assault force into the Trondheim's Fjord, a long arm of water cutting deep into the Norwegian interior that is, in its dimensions and character, a version of every other Norwegian fjord, confined, echoing, bounded by mountains that turn all sound back on itself and compress the space available to a large warship into a corridor whose walls feel closer than they are. The Norwegian coastal defences at Brettingen and Heisnes fire on the approaching German ships. The Hipper takes hits. The damage is not crippling, but it is real. Gunfire from coastal positions that German planning had assessed as posing minimal threat to a modern heavy cruiser has, again, penetrated armour, killed men and required emergency damage control. Trondheim falls nonetheless. The Hipper lands her troops and begins the withdrawal south. She is torpedoed on the return passage by the British submarine HMS Clyde. The damage is serious enough to require months of repairs. The Hipper reaches Germany, unlike the Karlsruhe, but she is out of the war for an extended period at the moment when the Kriegsmarine can least afford to lose her. The British attempt to retake Trondheim adds another dimension to the fjord geography's effect on the campaign. The Royal Navy plans an ambitious direct assault, Operation Hammer, that would send a naval force directly into the Trondheim's fjord to support Allied landings around the city. Admirals on the planning staff examined the approach routes into the fjord, assessed the Luftwaffe air threat to any surface force operating in confined waters within range of German aircraft, and conclude that the operation is not viable. The same fjord geometry that had made the German entry costly would make a British entry potentially catastrophic, except that Britain lacks the element of surprise that Germany had deployed on April 9th, and the Luftwaffe has now had days to establish itself at Norwegian airfields. Operation Hammer is cancelled before it launches. Instead, the Allies attempt an indirect approach, landing forces at Namsos to the north and Åndalsnes to the south of Trondheim, and attempting a pincer movement overland. The overland approach fails in the face of German air power, terrain that the Allied forces are not equipped for, and supply lines that cannot be sustained under Luftwaffe attack. The Allies evacuate both beachheads by early May. The fjord geography that frustrated the Germans at Drøbaksundet frustrates the British at Trondheim, not by sinking ships, but by making the direct naval approach too costly to attempt at all. The pattern is now visible, and it is consistent. At every point where the German landing forces enter the confined waters of the Norwegian fjords, they encounter a version of the same problem. The fjords that provide the corridor of approach also provide the conditions for shore-based defense. The mountains that make the fjords narrow funnel ships into killing grounds where the mathematics favor the defender even when the defender is outgunned. A ship in a fjord cannot maneuver. It can increase speed, which reduces the time it spends in the killing ground, but also reduces the accuracy of its own fire. It can return fire, but returning fire from a moving ship at a fixed shore position requires luck as much as gunnery skill. And it cannot retreat without turning, a maneuver that presents its full broadside length to the shore batteries for the duration of the turn. The fjord is not a neutral environment. It is an environment that systematically advantages whoever holds the high ground above the water. And in April 1940, for the critical hours before German troops can reach and overrun the fortress positions, that person is Norwegian. The fundamental error in German naval planning for Weserübung is an error of category. The planners have treated the Norwegian fjords as scaled-up versions of harbour approaches. Water features to be navigated, not terrain features to be contested. In doing so, they have imported into their planning assumptions that are correct for open water operations and fatal in confined fjord conditions. On the open sea, a modern heavy cruiser is effectively invulnerable to the kind of shore artillery that Oscarsborg mounts. The shell velocities, the armour thicknesses, the targeting solutions all favor the ship. In a fjord, at ranges measured in hundreds of meters rather than thousands, where the trajectory of fire is flat and close, and where the ship cannot present a small target by turning into or away from the threat, the same artillery that would be irrelevant at long range becomes potentially decisive. Birger Eriksson's guns were installed in 1893. They were designed to stop the warships of 1893. On April 9, 1940, at the range imposed by the geography of Drøbaksundet, they stopped a warship of 1940 instead. The fjord had made the guns relevant again. In the far north, at Narvik, the geography imposes its own version of this logic in a form that will take longer to become apparent, but that will ultimately produce the campaign's most consequential naval losses. 10 destroyers of the Kriegsmarine enter the Oslofjord in the pre-dawn darkness of April the 9th, carrying mountain troops of the 3rd Mountain Division under General Edvard Dietl. The Oslofjord is a different type of fjord from the Oslofjord, longer, deeper, branching into subsidiary arms called the Rombaksfjord, the Herjangsfjord and the Beisfjord, and at Narvik, where the fjord terminates, the iron ore pier and railway terminus that are the strategic objective of the entire campaign sit waiting in the winter darkness. 2 Norwegian coastal defense ships, the Eidsvold and the Norge, are anchored in the fjord. They are old ships. The Eidsvold was launched in 1899, the Norge in 1900, and they are not, by any rational military assessment, capable of stopping 10 modern destroyers. Their captains understand this. Commander Odd Isaacson Willoch commands the Eidsvold. He signals the approaching German force and receives in return an officer who tells him, in the pre-dawn darkness on the water between the ships, that Germany is taking Norway under its protection and asking the Eidsvold to surrender. Willoch signals back. He will resist. He fires a warning shot. The German destroyer Z-21 Wilhelm Heidkamp fires 3 torpedoes. The Eidsvold sinks in less than 2 minutes, taking nearly the entire crew with her. On the Norge, Commander Per Askim watches the Eidsvold go down and opens fire with everything his ship has. The Norge is struck by 2 more torpedoes and sinks in 4 minutes. 280 Norwegian sailors die in the Oslofjord before sunrise on April 9, 1940. In water whose temperature will kill an unprotected man in minutes. They had no chance of stopping the destroyers. They fired regardless because there was a flag on the mast and an order had been given, and the alternative was to lower the flag in the dark without firing a round, and that was something neither captain was willing to do. It is the quality of that decision, taken in seconds, in darkness, with complete knowledge of its consequences, that the Norwegian military remembers most clearly about the morning Narvik fell. The destroyers land their troops. Narvik falls by mid-morning. And Commodore Friedrich Bonte, commanding the destroyer flotilla from his flagship Z-21 Wilhelm Heidkamp, immediately confronts the problem that the Oslofjord's geography has created for him. His 10 destroyers cannot leave. The passage down the Oslofjord and out into the open Vestfjord and thence to the Norwegian Sea is a journey of roughly 40 kilometers through contested water. The fuel state of his destroyers, they have used their reserves in the high-speed transit from Germany, is insufficient for that journey, and the additional steaming required to reach a German port. The tanker Jan Velem, their designated resupply vessel, has arrived in the fjord ahead of schedule, but is transferring fuel slowly, limited by the equipment available and the conditions in the fjord, where weather and current make alongside transfer difficult. Bonte's destroyers need days to refuel completely. For those days, they are committed to the Oslofjord, their effectiveness as warships constrained by their fuel gauges. The fjord has swallowed them. On the morning of April the 10th, in a snowstorm that reduces visibility to hundreds of meters, Captain Bernard Warburton-Lee leads 5 British destroyers of the 2nd Destroyer Flotilla into the Oslofjord from the west. He has been at sea for 2 days, operating on intelligence that is incomplete and in conditions that are miserable, and he knows that what he is entering is a confined fjord, holding a substantially larger German force. He attacks at dawn without waiting for reinforcement, because waiting allows the German destroyers more time to refuel and increases the chance that they will be capable of breaking out before stronger British forces arrive. His flotilla sinks 2 German destroyers, and the supply ship Jan Willem at their moorings damages several others and sends the remaining German destroyers scattering into the subsidiary arms of the fjord system for shelter. Warburton-Lee is mortally wounded by German counterfire during the retirement. He is awarded the Victoria Cross. His attack accomplishes something beyond the immediate material destruction. It removes from the surviving German destroyers the last realistic hope of a coordinated breakout. The Jan Willem is gone. There will be no refueling. The destroyers are in the fjord permanently, committed to a defensive action they cannot ultimately win. 3 days later, on April 13th, HMS Warspite enters the Oslofjord with 9 destroyers as escort. Warspite displaces 33,000 tons and mounts 8 15-inch guns. She is a veteran of the Battle of Jutland in 1916 and has spent the intervening years being rebuilt and modernized. Nothing in the Oslofjord can stand against her broadside. The British force moves up the fjord methodically, using the Warspite's Swordfish floatplane to scout the subsidiary fjords where the German destroyers have taken shelter. The Swordfish locates and destroys a German submarine in the Fjord, the first submarine ever sunk by a carrier aircraft. The British destroyers fan into the branching arms of the fjord system and engage the German ships where they find them. The German destroyer crews fight where they have ammunition and scuttle or beach their ships when they do not. By the afternoon of April 13th, all 8 surviving German destroyers have been destroyed or rendered permanently inoperable. The bottom of the Oslofjord holds 10 warships. The Kriegsmarine's destroyer force has been reduced to approximately half its pre-campaign strength in a single fjord over 4 days. General Dietl's mountain troops, whose transport the destroyers provided, are now ashore at Narvik with no prospect of resupply by sea. Dietl has approximately 2,000 men, limited artillery, and the Ore Railway running east into Sweden as his only functioning line of communication. He establishes a defensive perimeter in the mountains east of Narvik and waits. He will wait for 7 weeks while Allied forces, British, French, and Polish, attempt to retake the town from the west and south, fighting through the kind of Arctic mountain terrain that the German planners who assigned this operation to Dietl's division had not looked at carefully on a topographic map. The Allied campaign at Narvik is ultimately successful. On May 28, 1940, Allied forces retake the town. It is, at that point, the only clear Allied ground victory of the entire war. 9 days later, the Allies abandon it because France has collapsed and the resources committed to Narvik are needed elsewhere. Dietl marches back into an empty Narvik on June 9th. The Ore Railway resumes. The strategic objective is recovered. The 10 destroyers stay on the bottom of the fjord. The Kriegsmarine's accounting for the Norwegian campaign, when Raeder compiles it in the weeks after the last Allied forces leave Norwegian soil, produces numbers that, presented in sequence, have the quality of a ledger in which every line is a loss. The Blücher sunk in the Oslofjord. The Königsberg sunk at Bergen by air attack. The Karlsruhe torpedoed and scuttled south of Kristiansand. The Lützow torpedoed in the Kattegat, out of action for months. The Hipper torpedoed, out of action for months. The Scharnhorst torpedoed during operations in the Norwegian Sea, under repair. The Gneisenau torpedoed twice, under repair. The 10 destroyers at Narvik all lost, several torpedo boats and auxiliary vessels at various points along the coast. When the ledger is totaled, the Kriegsmarine has lost, sunk, or temporarily out of action a significant fraction of its entire operational surface strength in a campaign lasting less than 2 months. Raeder carries this ledger to Hitler in July 1940, when the question of Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, is at its most urgent. Sea Lion requires crossing the English Channel against a Royal Navy that has lost no capital ships, no cruisers, and only a modest number of destroyers in the Norwegian campaign. Covering an invasion convoy across the Channel against concentrated Royal Navy opposition requires surface ships. Raeder has, available for immediate service in July 1940, 1 heavy cruiser, 2 light cruisers, and 4 destroyers. Against this force, the Royal Navy has 5 battleships, 11 cruisers, and approximately 30 destroyers in home waters. Raeder does not dress the numbers up. He presents them plainly. A contested channel crossing under those conditions, he tells Hitler, is not an operation the Kriegsmarine can support. The Royal Navy would destroy the invasion convoy. Sea Lion requires either air supremacy so total that the Royal Navy cannot operate in the Channel, a condition the Luftwaffe has not yet achieved and shows no sign of achieving, or a surface fleet capable of engaging and degrading the British warships protecting the crossing route. Germany has neither. Sea Lion is postponed indefinitely. It is never revived. Germany turns east toward the Soviet Union, toward the war that will consume it. The causal chain here is not speculative. It is documented in Raeder's own correspondence, in the OKW planning files, in the Kriegsmarine operational logs. The Norwegian campaign cost the surface fleet its capacity to support a channel crossing. The capacity to support a channel crossing was the one thing that might have created the conditions for a British negotiated settlement in the summer of 1940. Or at least the conditions for bringing sufficient pressure to bear that the political situation in London became genuinely uncertain. Whether Sea Lion could have succeeded even with a stronger Kriegsmarine is a question the historians have been arguing for 80 years without resolution. What is certain is that the Norwegian Fjords removed the question from the realm of practical military planning. Germany could not try. The destroyers were on the bottom of the Oslofjord. What the German planners in the autumn of 1939 failed to model adequately was not the fighting quality of the Norwegian coastal defences, which were old and limited and in most cases overwhelmed within hours. What they failed to model was the cumulative geometric structure of the fjord environment as a system, as a set of corridors that transformed the tactical situation faced by any ship entering them in a consistent and predictable way. Every fjord narrows toward its interior. Every narrowing creates a choke point. Every choke point creates a zone in which shore-based weapons, even obsolescent ones, achieve parity with or advantage over ship-based weapons. A ship can traverse this zone quickly, but traversing quickly increases navigation risk and reduces gunnery accuracy. A ship can traverse slowly, but traversing slowly increases exposure time. A ship cannot avoid the choke point without abandoning the objective that lies beyond it. There is no tactical solution to the choke point that does not involve accepting the risk the choke point creates. Germany accepted that risk across 6 simultaneous choke points on the morning of April 9, 1940, and on 3 of those 6, the choke point imposed costs that the campaign's architects had not factored into their assessment. The longer-term dimension of the fjord geography is less dramatic than the initial battle losses, but equally consequential. Germany controls Norway for 5 years. During those 5 years, the Kriegsmarine uses Norwegian ports, Narvik, Trondheim, Bergen, the Fjord near Trondheim, where the Tirpitz anchors in 1942, as bases for operations against Allied convoys in the North Atlantic and the Arctic. The U-boat arm benefits enormously from Norwegian base access, reaching convoy routes in the North Atlantic that would otherwise require much longer transits from German Baltic ports. The surface raiders, the Tirpitz, the Scharnhorst, later the Gneisenau during her Norwegian deployment, use the fjords as sheltered anchorages from which they can threaten Allied Arctic convoys without having to expose themselves to open sea engagement. In this sense, Raeder's strategic calculation was correct. Norwegian base access is valuable. It provides the Kriegsmarine with offensive reach it could not otherwise have achieved. but the fjords that shelter the remaining German surface units also imprison them. The Tirpitz, the most powerful surface unit the Kriegsmarine deploys to Norway, spends the greater part of her Norwegian service at anchor in the Fjord and later the Altarfjord, guarded by torpedo nets and anti-aircraft batteries and smoke generators, never engaging in a fleet action, representing a threat through her existence rather than her movement. She cannot move freely because every exit from every Norwegian fjord is now watched by British submarines and aircraft and surface forces that have had years to establish their patrols and perfect their intelligence networks. The fjord that shelters the Tirpitz also constrains her, and the constraint proves permanent. The Scharnhorst, attempting to attack a convoy in December 1943, leaves her Norwegian fjord anchorage in the Altarfjord and is intercepted and sunk by British forces in the Battle of North Cape. She goes to the bottom near the North Cape with most of her crew. The fjords are not a refuge. They are a trap with a comfortable interior and a dangerous exit, and the German ships that enter them in 1940 and after spent the war discovering whether the exit is survivable or not. There is a figure at the center of this story who does not appear prominently in most accounts of the Norwegian campaign, and who deserves considerably more than the footnote he typically receives. Colonel Birger Eriksen, the commander of Oscarsborg Fortress, was 65 years old on April 9, 1940. He had not fired the fortress guns at a living target in decades of service. He had no authorization from higher command to open fire on the approaching fleet. His telephone lines to Oslo were cut. He knew the legal risk he was taking. He looked at the unlit silhouette of the Blücher in the darkness of the channel and made a decision in seconds that shaped the outcome of the entire campaign, and through the chain of consequences it set in motion, the outcome of the summer of 1940. His order to fire gave the Norwegian government the hours it needed to escape Oslo. His order to fire meant that there was a Norwegian government in exile in London to coordinate Norwegian resistance and Norwegian intelligence operations for 5 years. His order to fire sent the Blücher to the bottom with the documents and the administrative materials and the personnel the Germans had brought specifically to establish a puppet administration in Oslo, materials that never reach their destination because the ship carrying them is still on the bottom of the Oslofjord. He is asked about it later many times. He answers with a brevity that is its own form of eloquence. He had a responsibility. He fulfilled it. The Blücher lies in the Oslofjord at Drubaksundet, 35 meters down, in water that the ferries passing above her disturb with the wash of their modern engines. She is classified as a war grave, which means her interior spaces are legally protected from salvage or disturbance. She still leaks oil, bunker fuel from her tanks, seeping slowly through cracks in the steel that decades of cold water have opened, and the oil surfaces in dark iridescent patches on the fjord above her, marking the spot where she rests, the way a wound marks the place on skin where something cut. The Norwegian Maritime Authority monitors the seepage. It has been monitoring it for decades. The oil cannot be easily pumped out without disturbing the remains of the men inside the ship, and the remains inside the ship have the legal protection that war graves extend to the dead. The Blücher continues, slowly, to give back to the fjord what the fjord gave her, cold and dark, and the patience of water that has no reason to hurry. The wrecks in the Oslofjord have their own post-war history. The Z-21 Wilhelm Heidkamp, Commodore Bonte's flagship, rests at approximately 60 meters in water so cold that the steel has corroded far more slowly than it would in warmer seas. Divers who have visited it describe the experience of moving through the interior compartments in the Arctic darkness, the torpedo damage still visible as a jagged gap in the forward hull, the command spaces where Bonte was killed still identifiable by the configuration of the compartments and the remains of the instruments. The other destroyers lie scattered across the Oslofjord and its subsidiary arms at varying depths, in varying states of preservation. They have become, in the decades since the war, objects of serious interest to Norwegian divers and underwater archaeologists, witnesses to a 4-day engagement that removed Germany's destroyer force from the war at the moment when that force might have been most consequential. The Norwegian campaign is assessed in most accounts as a German strategic success. Germany held Norway for 5 years. The ore route functioned. The Atlantic bases extended the reach of the U-boat arm in ways that had real consequences for the Battle of the Atlantic. The coastline never became a platform for Allied offensive operations against German territory. By these measures, Weserübung achieved its objectives. But this assessment rests on a selective ledger, one that counts the strategic gains and treats the naval losses as a necessary and ultimately acceptable cost. Raeder himself, in July 1940, sitting across from Hitler and explaining why the Kriegsmarine cannot support a channel crossing, is not finding the losses acceptable. He is finding them definitive. The surface fleet that was supposed to make Norway's strategic benefits usable in the wider war is not available to use them. What remains of the Kriegsmarine after April and May 1940 is a submarine force and a collection of surface units too damaged or too few to contest the Royal Navy where it matters. The fjords gave Germany what Raeder said they would give: bases, access, the ore route, the buffer. They charged for it in the currency Raeder had not fully priced, the ships that entered them and did not come back out. Some of those ships were lost to Norwegian shore batteries firing in the first hours of the campaign, when surprise was still Germany's greatest asset and Norwegian resistance was still finding its footing. Some were lost to British submarines waiting in the open water beyond the fjord exits, where the confined corridors of the Norwegian coast gave way to the sea. Some were lost to British aircraft, finding them at anchor in harbours they could not easily leave. The fjord system is not a trap in any single dimension. It is a trap in all dimensions simultaneously, at the narrow entrance where the shore batteries wait, in the confined waters where manoeuvre is impossible, at the exit where the submarines patrol, and in the harbour where aircraft can find a ship that geography has made stationary. Germany sailed its fleet into this system believing the advantages of the corridor outweighed the dangers of the trap. The ledger that Raeder presents to Hitler in July 1940 represents the final accounting of that belief.